I am genuinely struggling today. I'm getting beat by flowers and pollen, hay fever and allergies. Hey, it's Mel. Today I'm going to be covering a reincarnation case. I usually don't post videos such as this, but I have heard about reincarnation when I was around, I'd say 13 or 14. Me personally, I didn't really believe in reincarnation, but after reading this story, it piqued my interest. I usually post on Wednesdays. Everyone needs a hobby. This was really different to what I usually film. I film true crime cases. I'm aware that I do a lot of this. I don't know why. I'm aware that upon viewing my channel, you're probably going to think, this woman is insane. Why is she filming true crime cases, murder, serial killers? That's an understandable reaction. But honestly, I film videos and talk about cases that are unsolved in hopes that maybe we can all work together and solve them. I talk about true crime cases and killers, not to remember the victims that lost their lives. I make true crime and missing persons cases to keep the story alive, not only to help possibly find a missing person, but to also make people aware. I've said this before, but if I were to go to uni, I would study criminal psychology because that is something that has intrigued me. But this is by far one of the most interesting topics I have covered. Reincarnation is the religious belief after death a human being will start a new life in someone else's physical body, also called rebirth. Try to keep an open mind is all I'm saying, because after reading this story of this little boy, I do fully believe in reincarnation. Okay, people can believe what they want to believe. James's parents were both Catholic, and in the Catholic religion you're not really supposed to believe in reincarnation. It's not even a thought. James's dad, called Bruce, and his mum called Andrea, they were very religious people, and his dad at first didn't believe what his son was telling him. James was born in 1998 in Dallas, Texas. His mum was Andrea and his dad was Bruce, and later on they would move to Louisiana. James, as young as 2 years old, would have extreme knowledge of aviation type of planes, and he was more familiar with propeller planes. He knew the names of them. Andrea was a very protective mother of her son. He was an only child that they had. She said that her and her husband Bruce never taught their son of planes. As a young child, James watched kids shows like the Teletubbies, and he never watched anything to do with World War II. At age 2, James would have the same reoccurring nightmare of him being in a plane that took off from a boat and was shot down. James scared his parents with this reoccurring nightmare. It would happen between 4 to 5 times a week, and it was not stopping. Bruce and Andrea were really concerned of their son. Andrea asked her son James, "What's happening? Are you okay?" She was really concerned, and James said, and I quote, "Aeroplane crash, plane on fire, little man can't get out," end quote. James said that every time he woke up from this same reoccurring nightmare. James spoke of his nightmares saying that he had been shot down by a plane with a red sun on it. That red sun would actually turn out to be a Japanese warplane. One day, James and his mum Andrea were in a shop, and his mum picked up a plane that was a model propeller plane and said, "There's even a bomb at the bottom of it," end quote. Who, bear in mind is 2 at this time, turned to his mother and said, "That's not a bomb, that's a drop tank." How is a 2-year-old going to know what a drop tank is? His mum had no idea what a drop tank was. Now, for definition, a drop tank is an external fuel tank of an aeroplane that can be dropped or removed. Going back to James's nightmares, he would also kick his feet upwards to the ceiling as if he was acting out a scene from a movie or something. While his eyes were closed, he would be kicking his feet upwards, moving his hands about, saying, "Aeroplane crash. It's on fire, can't get out," end quote. What James was experiencing clearly wasn't something from a child's overreactive imagination, because he would speak about the same dream and it kept reoccurring. It was the same dream constantly 4 or 5 times a week, and it really started to concern James's parents so far that James's mum, Andrea, spoke to her mum, who was James's nana or grandma, whatever you want to say. The first person in the Younger family to suggest reincarnation was James's nana. Just before the family moved from Texas to Louisiana, Bruce took his son to the Cavern Flight Museum in Addison, Texas. With excitement, James shrieked as he saw an F-105 Thunder Chief plane, and he was mesmerised by this plane. His dad tried to get him away from the exhibit to go to the gift shop in the museum, go and look at other things in the museum, but for 3 hours James stood there mesmerised by this plane. To get James away from the F-105 Thunder Chief plane, James's dad ended up buying James a flight video of some kind, and James watched that constantly. Once he got home, that's all he watched. One day, James was being read a book by his mum, and he turned and said, and I quote, "Mama, the little man's going like this," end quote, and James kicked his feet towards the ceiling and said, and I quote, "Ow, ow, plane crash. Can't get out," end quote. Andrea asked James, "Who's the little man?" end quote. James replied, "Me," end quote. Andrea called Bruce into James's room and made James tell his dad the story that he just told his mum and to repeat the actions. Bruce asked James, quote, "Son, what happened to your plane?" end quote. James replied, quote, "It crashed on fire," end quote. And Bruce said, quote, "Why did your plane crash?" end quote. James replied, "It got shot," end quote. Bruce asked, "Who shot your plane down?" James replied with a disgusted face, "The Japanese." How is a 2-year-old gonna know about this stuff? The next day, James's Aunt Jen, she came over to the house, the Aunt Jen, and asked James, "How did you know it was the Japanese that shot your plane down?" And he said, "Because it had the red sun on it." Bruce, James's dad, did not believe in this thing. He tried everything to actually debunk what his son was telling him. Later on, James's parents asked him what the name of the little man was, and he said James. But at the time, his parents just thought that he was referring to himself, that he didn't really understand the question. Later on, James told his parents that he had flown a plane called the Corsair. James's dad Bruce did some research and found out that a small escort carrier called the Natoma Bay had been used in the Battle of Iwo Jima. Bruce, after finding out this information, decided to question his son. Bruce asked James, and I quote, "Do you remember what plane the little man flew?" James said, and I quote, "A Corsair," end quote. Bruce then asked his son where the plane took off from, and James said a boat. Bruce asked James if he knew the name of the boat, and James said the Natoma. Bruce was in shock that his 2-year-old son, who was still in nappies at this time, knew and got the correct information that there was a escort carrier called Natoma Bay, and there really was a plane called the Corsair. James knew that this plane, the Corsair, was used in World War II, and that it was launched from aircraft carriers. But Bruce did find out that the name Natoma Bay was an aircraft carrier that in fact was used in World War II. Andrea and Bruce ended up questioning James and saying, "Do you remember any of your friends that flown with you? Any other pilots?" And James said the name Jack Larson. Now, Jack Larson would later turn out to be based off a real person and a pilot who flew aboard the Natoma Bay. One time when James and Bruce were looking through a history book of Iwo Jima, I'm sorry if I pronounced that wrong. While Bruce and his son James were looking through the history of the Battle of Iwo Jima, James was sat close by but watching TV. He glanced at one of the pages of the book and pointed at a particular page and said, and I quote, "Daddy, that's where my plane got shot down," end quote. Bruce immediately took to the internet to check if this information was correct, and through searching the internet he found out that the Natoma had in fact been to Iwo Jima in 1945. At age 3, James began to draw, and he would always draw battles between planes and explosions. He would title his drawings Wildcats and Corsairs. James would call the Japanese planes Zeeks or Bettys. And when his mum asked him why those names, James said, "The boy planes were fighters and the girl planes were bombers," end quote. Bruce checked this information on the internet and found out that his son was indeed correct. An author named Carol Bowman, who wrote many books on reincarnation, visited James at his house. James, at one point during this visit, told Carol that the Corsair planes that he flew used to get flat tires all the time, and they would always turn to the left when they took off. This is correct. James' parents did some research, and after contacting many veterans of the carrier Natoma Bay, they finally found out during the Battle of Iwo Jima, a man who was also a fighter pilot had died, and his name was Lieutenant James McCready Houston Jr. But I am going to be referring to him as James Houston or just Houston, so you don't get confused. Think back to when his parents asked him what was the name of the little man. James. And it would later turn out to be correct, as the man was named James Houston. James's story was beginning to get really popular in the media. After doing extensive research, Bruce could not find anyone that had died by the name of Jack Larson, though through media attention, James's parents eventually did find out that there was a man still alive living in Arkansas. This was the same Jack Larson who also served aboard the Natoma Bay, and he was a pilot. Just as James said, the day that James Houston died, Jack Larson was actually his wingman and he was his friend. Excuse my language, but this is mind-blowing. I was reading this article and I got halfway through it and I almost shit myself. I'm not gonna lie, because I was like, hang on, how is it possible for a 2-year-old, or 3 at this point, to know this stuff? Who was James Houston? James Houston was in fact a World War II pilot from Pennsylvania who had been killed in Iwo Jima. James Houston was born in 1923 in October. In 1945 he died at age 21 on the 3rd of March. The day of James Houston's death was in fact his last mission to do before he returned back to the US, though sadly he died that day. He did volunteer for this mission, and there was one inconsistency in James's story. He claimed to his parents over and over again that he flew a plane called the Corsair, though after Bruce did some digging, he found out that James Houston did not fly a plane called the Corsair on the day of his death. On the day of James Houston's death, he in fact was flying a FM-2 Wildcat fighter plane. The story of James Houston is that he was a fighter pilot who died in the Battle of Iwo Jima after his plane took off from Natoma Bay, and as it was leaving Natoma Bay, it was shot down by a Japanese plane. Everything that James had said was making sense. In February of 2003, Bruce got a hold of James Houston's sister, Anne Houston Barron, who was married. She was an old woman, and she, through a series of phone calls between her and Bruce and Andrea and James, they became friends. When they started talking, Bruce didn't tell Anne of his son's ability, like maybe he is the reincarnation of her brother. I mean, how are you supposed to say that on a phone call? After they had many conversations, Bruce eventually did tell Anne Barron of his son's unusual ability and the fact that he could be linked to her brother, James Houston. This obviously came as a shock to Anne Barron, and over time she did start to believe. In 2003 of March, she sent photos and personal belongings of her brothers to Bruce, Andrea and James. And the package that Anne Barron Houston sent to the Leanger family included a photo of James Houston standing in front of a Corsair plane. If you think, okay, is that it? Is it going to get any weirder? Of course it is. James had 3 G.I. Joe dolls and he named them Leon, Walter and Billy. Those names were also the names of the 3 pilots that served with James Houston. According to the US Pacific Fleet records, they had records of the names of Lieutenant Leon Connor along with Walter John Devlin and Billy Rufus Peter, and they were among the 21 fatalities of Natoma Bay. These men were also a part of an air squadron called VC-81 with Houston. Now I'm going to tell you the paranormal side of it. One day, Bruce asked James why he named his G.I. Joe dolls those specific names, and he said, and I quote, "Because they greeted me when I went to heaven," end quote. Mate, what? Like, bear in mind that those 3 names that I mentioned, they're dead. They died in Natoma Bay. Andrea recalled an incident where she gave her son, James, meatloaf for the first time, and James turned around and said to his mum that he hadn't had meatloaf since he was on the Natoma Bay. Bruce and Andrea contacted 7 veterans from the carrier and found out that meatloaf was a regular meal for the crew. Now we're going to talk about the day James Houston's plane went down. According to James, he told his parents that in his dreams, his plane got shot in the engine. Through further research, this turned out to be correct. James Houston's plane was shot in the engine and it caused a fire at the front of the plane. Bruce questioned his son and said, "Where did the fire happen?" And James looked at a model plane that he had and pointed to the nose of the plane. This was all true. James Houston did die as his plane caught fire due to the Japanese plane hitting it. As a young child, wherever James went, he would always make sure there were fire extinguishers around and made sure that they were available for use in case of an emergency or a fire. James Houston's plane crashed into Futamiko Harbour, which was the same place that James pointed to in the picture of the Iowa Gym Battle Book, the history book that his dad had been reading. And that is when he said, "Daddy, that's where my plane got shot down. That's it." That incident happened in November 2000. To this day, James still is remembering his past life. Things that have happened, memories. Usually in child reincarnation cases such as this, children will lose or forget their memories around the age of 7. During World War II, the Natoma boat was in the Pacific Ocean. Like I said before, the only specific detail that was inconsistent with James's story is the fact that he claimed that the day he died he was in a Corsair plane. Though after Bruce did further investigating, he found out that before James Houston joined the Natoma Bay, he was a part of an air squadron called the VF-301 in 1944, the year before Houston's death. This was an elite squadron that Houston was a part of, and the squadron test flew Corsairs for carrier use, and only 21 pilots were selected for this assignment. VF-103 was disbanded after 8 months, and James Houston was transferred to VC-81. That was it. That was the last part of the puzzle that needed solving. That was the one detail. That's why James was so adamant that he flew a Corsair when he died. But in all actuality, he did not fly a Corsair when he died, but he was a part of an elite squadron and he did test fly Corsairs. As Bruce was doing all this research, he remained skeptical at first, but I mean, there's only so much you can deny. After James's story and all of it made sense, James's dad's skepticism meter was running back and he started to believe his son, and he to this day, along with his wife Andrea, believes that their son was reincarnated and tells his life as a World War II fighter pilot. Going back to the phone calls between Bruce and Anne Barron Houston, James actually got the opportunity to meet the sister of James Houston, and he called her by her nickname, Annie. Now, according to her, no one calls her Annie. The only person that gave her the nickname Annie and called her that was James Houston. And James, the little boy, knew of 2 paintings that were self-portraits of James Houston and his sister. They were separately painted and they were young children at the time when the paintings were done. Not a single soul knew of these paintings except James Houston and his sister. So how this little boy knew of that specific detail, not a clue. With all the specific details this child knew from such a young an age, the drawings, the names of his G.I. Joe dolls, the fact that he knew what a drop tank was and his mum didn't, the fact that he knew where he died, he had vivid dreams which actually turned out to be memories. All of this evidence came together, and to make things even more creepy, one day Bruce was in the back garden raking leaves together and James was there in the garden with him. Bruce turned and said to James that he was so happy to have him as a son, and James said, and I quote, "That's why I picked you. I knew you would be a good daddy," end quote. First of all, you're thinking, picked? You picked your father? What? That doesn't make sense, right? Well, as James continued to talk, he said, and I quote, "When I found you and Mummy, I knew you would be good to me," end quote. Bruce asked James, "Where did you find us?" James replied, with the most chilling detail of all, and I quote, "In Hawaii. I found you at the Big Pink Hotel. You were on the beach. You were eating dinner at night," end quote. Bruce was dumbfounded, speechless. The scariest thing is, this was true. In 1977, Bruce and Andrea went to Hawaii and stayed at the Royal Hawaii, which was a Big Pink hotel located on Waikiki Beach. On the last evening of staying in Hawaii, the couple had a dinner by moonlight on the beach. 5 weeks later, Andrea became pregnant with James. I mean, call it what you will, but there's a lot of skepticism of if this is BS, if it's not, if it's a hoax. I do believe in reincarnation after reading this story, and I'm sure you do too. You're probably creeped out like I am. That specific detail of him describing the Pink Hotel on Waikiki Beach in Hawaii having a dinner by moonlight, and then 5 weeks later Andrea is pregnant with James. That detail creeped me out entirely. So what do you think? Is it a hoax? Is it not? His parents took him to Iwo Jima to look at the memorial of the people who lost their lives during the battle that day in 1945. James saw like all of the people. He saw their graves and started emotionally crying. Like, he got so emotional. Like, his parents had never seen him cry like that before. He got so emotional because as James Houston, his former friends that served the war with him were passed away. Granted, kids have very huge imagination, they're very creative, but James recounted very specific details that he just couldn't have known. Like, his parents know him, he watches Teletubbies. How is a child going to know that? Unless he's a reincarnation of the World War II pilot James Houston. To me, I find it incredible how a little boy as young as age 2 could have known all those specific details. What do you think? Do you believe in reincarnation? Thank you so much for watching. I'm very appreciative of the support I've been given, and I will see you all next week. Stay safe. Bye.